Welcome to the Craftsman Online Podcast, the only 5-star rated Masonic podcast in New York State. Any opinions, thoughts, or viewpoints shared during this program are that of the individual and do not reflect the official position of any Grand Lodge, appendant, or concordant body from which that member may hail. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, co-founder of CraftsmanOnline.com, and you've joined us for an episode of trying to figure out what the heck is a hecatomb. As deep in the Master Mason's degree, there is that one word that has perplexed many Freemasons: Hecatomb. And in this episode, Brother John Nagy returns as we trace the origins of the meaning of the word, its application and relevance to the stated principles of Freemasonry, and basically how the heck a hecatomb invites Masons to explore the allegory of our ritual. Welcome back, Brother John.
Thank you once again for having me, Brother Michael. It's an honor and a privilege.
This is probably the most researched podcast I have done for the two of us, and that's saying something when you think about the topics and themes that we've discussed. Why don't you help us here with the beginning of hecatomb? It's really not a word that you hear every day. What's the origin of that word?
It comes from Greek. In fact, you'll see it in Homer's Iliad, I think somewhat around 9 times throughout the entire text, in various different ways and manners and forms, not always indicating a sacrifice. And I'm sure that Homer, being as ancient as his writings are, that it was around long before then. But the origins are basically, or the etymology is 100 Heca, tome, head of oxen, not cattle, but oxen.
I'm sure our listeners like something sounds different about Brother John. He doesn't have a cold, and he's not doing his Lou Rawls impression. But you recently were at an all-day speaking event, basically, and this is the byproduct of it.
I was up in Marianna, Florida, about an hour west of Tallahassee, with about 20 brothers who came together, and I put on a 6-hour workshop. Believe it or not, it's going to be the prototype for the 6-week course that I'll be putting on for the Grand Lodge of Florida back, in 2023, if all things unfold as is intended. And as a result of doing 6 solid hours of nonstop talk, and of course a 4.5-hour drive home with the speakerphone blaring, I was talking for, roughly about 10.5 hours of drive time and presentation time. So what you're hearing now is me with my vocal cords coming down off the rush, and they are definitely swollen. And, my wife loves it because I have my Lou Rawls voice.
Yeah, I do too. You sound like one of the R&B DJs from the 70s. If you start taking requests, I know we've gone too far. But on this episode of the podcast, we're defining hecatomb. We've gotten to the point of ancient Greek word, sacrificing up to 100 cattle to Greek gods, and practice as few as actually 10 could make up a hecatomb. You talked that Homer had made the reference 9 times to the word hecatomb in the Iliad, and our ritual describes the shouting of Eureka after the discovery of the 47th problem in Euclid. It's just that one little word that's there. Is our ritual accurate in the description of what a hecatomb and the meaning of where it came from in context?
Ritual draws from historical characters and historical events, but most of all what is stated within ritual is allegory, which basically means it's put forth to communicate a truth, but not fact. So when you hear Pythagoras screaming Eureka, the progenitors of our ritual had an unbelievably awesome but subtle sense of humor. And when you hear things like that and you are well versed in history, you cannot help but smile and recognize that it's not Pythagoras who was known for screaming Eureka. It's Archimedes, when he discovered displacement by going into a tub of water and noticing that the water had overflowed because his body displaced the water. And at that particular point in time, history tells us that he screams Eureka. Archimedes, not Pythagoras. However, It was thrown into our ritual, sewn in there as an Easter egg of delight for those individuals who know history well. They would hear that Pythagoras was claimed to have screamed Eureka, and you can't help, if you're learned or at least well read, that you're going to recall that that was Archimedes. It's a giggle. It's an Easter egg intended to titillate the people who are well read. And so what happens is now they're going to be listening for other Easter eggs because, well, the rituals that we have throughout the world are sewn with Easter eggs all over the place. And perhaps we can cover Easter eggs in another conversation.
Oh, I think we should. Because, I mean, one of the things that fascinates me, I had at my lodge here in D.C., a brother got up and talked about the Greek classical philosophers and spoke in depth about Pythagoras. And there's a question I'm going to follow up on this a little bit later on something else that was interesting with Pythagoras and cattle. But I've always wondered why we do this. I've heard of like artistic license and freedom, but we do this a lot in our ritual where we take things out of context or literally just create our own fiction in some of the lectures that we share.
So I'll ask you the question, what exactly is allegory? And the fact of the matter is, allegory is a time-honored manner to communicate truth. Not fact, but truth. And as a result of where we borrowed our morality plays from, they were all based in allegory, meaning that when you talk about King Solomon, you're really not talking about King Solomon, the character out of the Bible, the historical character, or any character at all, other than the fact that they are personifying wisdom. And so when you hear King Solomon in an allegorical sense, you are supposed to understand that as, okay, we're not talking about King Solomon, we're talking about wisdom in general. And if you replace the words King Solomon with wisdom throughout our ritual, the ritual takes on an entirely different meaning.
I'm thinking of the line that you hear so much, veiled in allegory. And I'm listening to you talk about this, and I'm like, maybe the reason why we do this is because we're wrong enough to be right. That the way that we protect a secret is by not fully revealing it, but giving you that curtain behind. And if you are smart enough to figure it out, you got it.
That is the whole basis of allegory. It masks and it reveals at the same time. Those individuals who don't look past the surface, the EA mentality, just the skin, what happens is they'll take it at face value. Whereas if you are having a fellow craft or master mason level, you're going to look beyond the skin and look for the meat and even the core, the bone of what's actually being communicated. And the same thing has to do with this little ditty that was sewn into ritual, which, by the way, does not appear in all rituals throughout the entire United States and the world. It is just a handful that have the word hecatomb thrown in there, and even Eureka. And, I am blessed to have been exposed to the Eureka Pythagoras connection with the hecatomb. And I am grateful that I did, because as a consequence, I have much deeper appreciation for what Freemasonry is intending to communicate.
What I appreciate in my time with you, and I love the 30 minutes that we get to have, these podcast episodes, is that for so much of the, I would say, first chapter of my Masonic career, I spent going through the first part of our degrees, the obligations, the signs, all. And now I spend more time reading the lectures and the charges, because words like the hecatomb, you're like, I don't ever remember having to memorize that when I did any other part of the lodge ritual for the conferral of the. This must have come from, oh my gosh. And in this particular instance, I feel comfortable talking openly about the 47th problem of Euclid and how it's all laid out in even New York ritual, because it is non-ciphered. This is a part that seems to be pretty standard, and it's not really a Masonic secret of all, which that also made me wonder, after hearing another brother speak about the life of Pythagoras, he was known to be a vegetarian. What would be the significance of a vegetarian sacrificing 100 cattle to a Greek god?
And there is where hermeneutics comes into play. If you don't understand how to interpret or take in and decode and understand what is being communicated, you're going to miss the point. The first thing, we covered the eureka. It's a giggle. It's a Easter egg intended to bring a little smile to the faces of the individuals listening. And then we are confronted with the fact that he went ahead and sacrificed a 100 head of oxen, until we start recognizing through hermeneutical studies that, well, we know that Hecatomb stands for 100 head of oxen, but we come to find it as it has transitioned in use that it could be 100 head of livestock in general. It doesn't make a difference whether it's oxen or not. And then we come to find, well, actually, it's just a sacrifice. If you're using the term, instead of just referring to it as livestock, we're also saying that in some cases within context, it is used to describe that livestock being sacrificed. Well, then you have to start looking at the fact that, well, sacrifice could be one of many things, but the most blaring definitions that are used is, well, was it a holocaust or a hecatomb when we're referring to a sacrifice? And the fact of the matter is a holocaust is a total burnt offerings, whereas a hecatomb is you only burn the bone and you burn the fat. What you do is you roast the meat and you share it with the people who attended the hecatomb. So we find that a hecatomb is not so much a total burnt offering, but one where the individuals who come together to do the hecatomb are being nurtured by that which was being either being nurtured not by that which is burned, but that which is roasted and left over for the attendees. And then,
so it's basically like a Greek barbecue.
Spot on, Brother Michael, spot on, because when you read it within context, and the surviving text of the Iliad in 2 paragraphs spells out that the hecatomb occurred and they served the roasted offerings to those who attended while they did this all day, while they sang, while they danced, while they swapped stories, where they were basically nurtured not only physically by the roasted offerings, but intellectually by what was shared, emotionally by the bonding and support of the the attendees, and last but not least, spiritually, because this was all offered to the gods. The most ultimate concerns of the people putting on the hecatomb was to share their thanks with the gods. So there was a spiritual nurturing going on too. There's a really heavy message behind all that.
Yeah, we're gonna get into that because we know that the word eureka not credited to Pythagoras. We do know that he did discover the 47th problem of Euclid, which is a part of our Master Mason's degree. It was one of the first Masonic symbols that when I walked into the building of my mother lodge and I looked up, I'm like, why is that? What is that? What is the purpose? And again, my Masonic mentor at the time, all of this will be explained to you. And I'm like, I don't believe you. I don't see how that has anything to do with this other picture of a sword going through someone's heart. Like, where does this? And now it's all beginning to come together. I'd really like to talk about the significance of that 47th problem of Euclid in the Master Mason's degree, because I feel like it doesn't really get its due. It just gets that one paragraph, and that's really it. For those that it's been a while since geometry class, help recall what that problem or what that process established, and then the Masonic principles of that.
First and foremost, Pythagoras was said to have discovered that. However, we know from history that he most likely was told about it by the Egyptians. Now, I'm not going to debate one way or the other the validity of it, other than the fact that when it became clear to him that there was a relationship between one side and another and a third, he formulated in his own mind an understanding that the relevance of those connections mathematically was significant, in such that he got very excited about it. And he had so excited about it that he decided that he was going to serve up a hecatomb, which meant essentially he was going to thank gods for this revelation, this revealed light. And not only was he going to thank gods for it, but he was also going to share this light during that thanking process with his brothers and peers and his disciples. And so he went ahead and held a hecatomb to not only nurture them physically, emotionally, spiritually, but also intellectually, so that they too would be able to carry this light out into their lives and apply it as they needed. Pythagoras was a vegetarian. We hear he sacrificed a hecatomb, which, again, hermeneutics tells us that's 100 head, or it's livestock in some fashion or form. However, if you go into the history of Pythagoras, he had two peers that used to make comment on Pythagoras, and one of them said, yes, indeed, he did sacrifice a hecatomb. And a rebuttal to that was another peer of his turns around and writes down, yeah, he did sacrifice a hecatomb, but it was made of wheat. It was a substitute. So basically what he did was he served up what could even be construed as bread, some sort of wheat product that was shaped in such a way that it would be acceptable to the gods as a sacrifice, aka hecatomb. Pythagoras, again, not only was a vegetarian, but he revered life to the point where, he would step around stuff from what we've been told, just to make sure that the life was honored. He believed, I believe he believed in reincarnation too. I think it was him. Suffice it to say that when we hear that he sacrificed a hecatomb, right away, you say, oh, that was neat. He sacrificed a hecatomb, 100 head of oxen. Then we find out, well, maybe it was just livestock in general. And then, wait a second, he is a devout vegetarian respecter of life. So how does this meet up? What's really interesting is, as a consequence of hearing this entire statement about Pythagoras, Eureka, hecatomb, what unfolds is, by exploring the details behind the statement, you start to realize some really significant things. And that is, the superficial first impression is not necessarily correct. And that's the whole idea behind the allegorical communications. It was put forth as a statement of fact, where we know it's not. It's an allegorical conveyance of truth. And then we find is that, it's not necessarily the way we imagined it playing out in our heads, but it does have just absolute significance to our Masonic journey.
Well, what I appreciate was in that background is, thinking about the 47th problem of Euclid, and that basically the mathematic principle of it is being able to define angles and find an angle that would be equal to another angle based on the proportions of the two that they share in common. And as you're talking about that with the hecatomb, and I'm thinking about the 47th problem of Euclid, the first thing that came to my mind was perhaps there is a significance into how the tables are arranged during a festive board in Freemasonry, that we actually are sitting in right angles that are equal to each other, looking across from each other. And the whole point of a festive board, yes, it's looked at now as kind of a social event, for modern Masons. But really the point of it was as a celebration, an offering, a thanks. We'd give several toasts.
when I do my presentations every once in a while, more originally, but sometimes now, I'll welcome people to my Hecatomb, and they'll look at me and I'll go into it. I said, and I'll tell them the background of the Hecatomb if they've not heard it before, or the significance of it, and the fact that when we come together as brothers, we are to come together to have a Hecatomb. We are to make sure that every gathering, especially a table lodge, we come together in the spirit of Pythagoras, where we are sharing light and we are sharing breaking bread, so to speak, and we are nurtured physically, intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually in every single one of our gatherings. And if we don't have that going on in our gatherings, we're really not following in the footsteps of Pythagoras, a supposedly, again, allegorical brother. And when I hear that a jurisdiction doesn't have the Hecatomb in their lecture, I say, well, you're just missing out on something that could really unfold and be special for everybody. That being missing, what I share is my story and how a Hecatomb really is the reason why we get together, is to share light, as Pythagoras did once he made discovery in the connections and the significance of the proportions and relationships between angles and sides. And we do the same thing. We come together and hopefully always share something significant that is nurturing both physically, well, not both, but physically, emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually in all our gatherings.
This conversation is one of those where I will sit down with other brothers that have also esoteric views that go beyond what is in our ritual. And I will say to them, where in the ritual do you get the idea about chakras or this or that? And they will point to, well, basically to paraphrase, when you know, you pick up these little things that open your mind to then take you to the next thought. My point here is with the 47th problem of Euclid is we are looking at it. Unfortunately, I think some brothers look at it scholastically in the mindset of, oh, it's a lesson in geometry. But when you get into the deeper part of it, and you're like, nope, it's about right angles and finding the distance and equilateral and what is equal to this. Then you can sit there and go, wow, where are two other massive right angles in Freemasonry? Like, where do these other two concepts exist? And now you understand why this is here in our ritual, but to some it is looked at as being tucked away, that lesson there.
And I'll go one step further, because what you're doing is you're basically expanding on geometry that is beyond the geometrical lesson. Now it's into the symbols of Freemasonry. And I'll go back to what Pythagoras became aware of is that there is hidden information in what is being provided. If I give you a side, let's say it's two cubits, two whatever, and then I give you another side and it's two. And then what happens is we say, all right, the angle between these two is perpendicular. It is a precise 90 degrees. Well, how do we find the distance between the farthest points of those two lines where they end? And we'll call that the hypotenuse. Well, you might want to measure that. But if that is unknown and you don't have anything other than the measurement of the two sides, and you need to know what the measure is of that third side, what happens is there's hidden information that tells you exactly what you need to discover what that distance is. But you have to be educated in how to treat that information. So by applying special formulas that are hidden in the geometry of the actual figure, we come to find that, well, if you merely take the distances of those two sides and square them, add them together, and then take the square root of that, you wind up with the hypotenuse. And it's like, if I did not know the relationship between one side and the other and how it can be used to find a missing piece of information, well, I'd be scratching my head. However, now that we know there is a relationship between the two sides, by squaring each side, adding them together, and taking the square root of each, we can discover or reveal a third parameter within that distance, that triangle that is formed. And the idea behind Pythagoras is to communicate to Masons that this is one of a multitude of things that is hidden in plain sight. And if you shape your mind, educate your mind, train your mind, discipline your mind, after, of course, you discipline your heart and bring order to the chaos of your heart, what happens is you wind up knowing more about what is right in front of you than most people. Just like Pythagoras was able to find relationships between things, you too, as a master Mason, if you've done the work of the EA and Fellowcraft degrees, not the actual ritual, but what the ritual directs us to do, what happens is you've trained your heart and your mind to be able to see past things that would give you one impression on the surface and an entirely different impression underneath. And that's the significance of that entire, what the heck is a hecatomb? When you go past the surface, so much more is revealed. And that's the lesson of Pythagoras, is that he was able to go beyond the surface and see things that were there that most people are just absolutely oblivious to.
Yeah, for me, I can't thank you enough, because, yes, it's a fun word to say. We don't hear it very much in our everyday lives. If you're lucky now, the next time you sit through a Master Mason degree, especially the second section when the working tools are more fully explained, and you hear that word hecatomb, it'll bring a smile to your face, because you can start doing that internal reflection, as you're saying, Brother John, because it does. We can do it operatively, where we learn to listen to both sides of a story to form the third version of possibly what really did happen. There's a practical use for it. And then, speculatively, we can sit here and say, I need many sources that are equal, that can also produce, the common theme of what applies to me. And unless I had this time to talk with you, it would have just been a funny word that I would have heard after Eureka and been like, what the heck is a hecatomb? This has been the Craftsman Online Podcast. I want to thank our guest this week for coming back on, deep voice and all. No, not Brother Lou Rawls, Brother John Nagy.
Once again, my good brother, thank you so much.
I think I'm going to have you cut the intro for the podcast with the deep voice that you have now.
You're listening to WMAS Masonic Radio with your host, Coach John Nagy, Master Mason and Deep Voice Extraordinaire.
If you've enjoyed this episode and you want to hear more, you can just say, hey Siri or hey Alexa, play the Craftsman Online Podcast. We are available on every streaming platform with new episodes every Monday morning. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.